Stuart had dreamed of a peaceful life in Parkview Estate, a cozy, tree-lined neighborhood he imagined would be his personal oasis. But on the very day he unpacked his last moving box, he felt an unsettling chill in the air. Little did he know that beyond his neat property lines, a lurking storm was waiting to break loose. That storm had a name: Karen Fowler, the iron-fisted president of the local HOA. Even as he marveled at the fresh paint on his walls and the perfect layout of his backyard, hints of trouble began creeping in, like the hush among neighbors when Karen's name slipped into conversation and the ominous glances thrown toward Stuart's pristine lawn. Everyone seemed afraid to speak openly. Stuart sensed that something was dangerously off. He never guessed that weeks later he'd find himself building a colossal, fortress-like wall around his yard, or that the entire community would be dragged into a whirlwind of lawsuits, humiliating truths, and a last-minute twist that would shock everyone, including Karen Fowler herself. Want to find out how a quiet new homeowner turned into the most talked-about rebel in Parkview Estate? Keep watching, because this story is about to explode with drama, betrayal, and a final showdown you won't believe. Hey, before we jump into this wild story, I have a small favor to ask. If you could take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, it would really help our channel grow and bring you even more crazy stories like this one. Also, we love seeing where our audience is tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let us know which city you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far our community is spreading. Stuart stood at the edge of his backyard in Parkview Estate, gazing at his property lines with pride. This was the moment he had waited for. No more cramped apartment walls, no more landlord restrictions. He had a deed with his name on it, and now the space to build that dream garden and patio he'd always wanted. The sun was bright, the breeze was gentle, and everything felt possible until she appeared. Karen Fowler, the self-proclaimed queen of Parkview Estate, marched across Stuart's lawn, carrying a clipboard and wearing a stiff expression. She had a short blonde bob and the kind of permanent scowl that made you feel like you'd already done something wrong. Standing in front of Stuart with zero introduction, she launched into her spiel. "You see this section here?" Karen tapped a folded map with her pen, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is actually HOA property, a community walkway. The previous owner just never enforced it." Stuart blinked, at first thinking she must be mistaken. "That can't be right. My deed clearly shows this is my backyard. All of it." Karen looked up, smirking. "The HOA has decided to reclaim it, so you'll need to move whatever you planned here, effective immediately." Something about her tone made a cold sweat break out on Stuart's neck. How could she so casually talk about taking land that he legally owned? He tried to remain calm. "I'm sorry, but you can't just decide to take someone's property. I paid for this land and I have the documents." Karen's thin smile widened. "Oh, Stuart, I've been president of the Parkview Estate HOA for years. Our rules override personal whims. If you fight us, you will lose." Stuart's frustration turned into disbelief. "That's not how property law works." Karen raised her eyebrows. "We'll see." With that, she turned on her heel and strutted off. Just a few days later, an official-looking letter arrived. It demanded Stuart surrender a 10-foot strip of his backyard for the benefit of the community. The letter threatened everything from steep fines to legal action if he didn't comply. Stuart felt sick, but he refused to back down. He decided to check the official city records for his property lines. Sure enough, he was correct. The land was his, no question about it. Armed with copies of the official documents, he marched into the next HOA meeting, which took place in a drab conference room at the local community center. The walls were painted a dull beige, and a few potted plants sagged in the corners. About 20 people attended, but nobody seemed eager to sit near Stuart, except for one guy named Marvin, who gave him a sympathetic nod. When Stuart confronted Karen, she barely glanced at his evidence. "HOA policies supersede private ownership," she said, speaking slowly as if addressing a clueless child. "That's just not true," Stuart insisted. Karen leaned forward. "I've done this before, you know. We can make your life miserable with violations, fines, and—" She paused. The entire room was silent, as if everyone was too scared to defend Stuart. "If you keep arguing, you'll see what I mean." Stuart looked around, hoping someone would speak up. But the board members stared at the table, while a few neighbors gave him pitying looks. That was the moment he realized that Karen had terrorized this community for years. One by one, neighbors started telling him stories after the meeting. A family forced to tear down a beloved treehouse because Karen said it was too tall. A retiree who got fined hundreds of dollars for having a garden gnome on her lawn. Another couple had been threatened with foreclosure over holiday lights that Karen deemed excessive. Stuart felt his anger grow. Someone needed to stand up to this petty dictator. Sure enough, the harassment started almost immediately. First came a violation notice for improper lawn maintenance, even though Stuart's grass was freshly cut. Next, he was told that his patio chairs were not in compliance with HOA standards. The worst was when he found that his property corner markers had been yanked out of the ground. Someone replaced them with a sign that read, "Future Community Walkway, courtesy of the HOA." The final straw was discovering his mailbox missing one morning. At first, he wondered if it had been stolen by a random thief. But in the next HOA newsletter, he saw a note stating certain mailboxes violated design rules and had to be removed. He realized that Karen's pettiness knew no bounds. Even messing with a mailbox, which could trigger federal offenses, was on her menu of intimidation tactics. The neighbors tried to comfort him, but there was fear in their voices. "Karen always wins," they muttered. "Your best bet might be to give up." But Stuart refused. He reached out to a property lawyer named Nina, who specialized in shady HOA disputes. Nina confirmed that his deed was clear, the land was his, and the HOA had zero authority to seize it. She sent them an official cease and desist letter, giving Karen and the board 48 hours to back down. But instead of backing down, Karen doubled her harassment. More fines, more intimidation. She even tried to claim that Stuart was conducting illegal construction when he wasn't. City inspectors came to check, found nothing wrong, and left apologetically. Finally, as he lay awake one night after fuming over the missing mailbox, Stuart came up with a bold plan. If the HOA wanted to steal his land for a walkway, he'd make sure they could never use it. He would build a towering wall, 20 feet tall if allowed, that would overshadow everything Karen tried to do. Stuart jumped into research mode. Parkview Estate had some local zoning restrictions, sure, but as he pored over the legal codes, he discovered a loophole. There was a limit to front yard fence heights, but not for structures within the back property. As long as it was structurally sound and not interfering with utility lines, it was perfectly legal no matter how tall. He dialed up a local construction company explaining he wanted a very high privacy wall. They asked if he was building a medieval fortress or something. Stuart just smiled and said, "You could say that." He had enough in his savings to fund this project, so why not go all in? He pictured Karen's face turning purple with rage, and that alone was worth it. Early on a Saturday morning, a large construction truck rumbled down his street, loaded with cement blocks, steel beams, and enough materials to build something that could repel an army. Workers hopped out in hard hats and neon vests, measuring and prepping the site. The roar of machinery echoed through the neighborhood. It wasn't long before Karen Fowler stormed over, her arms waving like an angry traffic cop. "Stop!" she yelled at the foreman. "You can't build this! You're in violation of HOA guidelines!" The foreman, a grizzled guy named Tony, barely looked up. "We got the permits," he said plainly, continuing to measure the ground. Karen's face twisted. "Permits from who?" Stuart stepped in. "From the city, the same city you tried to trick with your bogus complaint, Karen. Everything is legal." She shook her head. "You can't possibly be allowed to build a 20-foot wall. It's an eyesore. It'll drive down home values, and it's just outrageous." Stuart shrugged. "I'm only protecting my property, which I legally own." Karen glared at him, her voice growing shrill. "I'll call an emergency HOA meeting. We'll shut this down." He smiled politely. "You do that." Karen stomped away, furiously scrolling through her phone. Meanwhile, Tony and his crew laid the foundation. By the time they finished the first row of cinder blocks, half the neighborhood was out on their lawns, gawking. Some seemed startled, but others subtly nodded in approval, whispering to each other that maybe, just maybe, Karen was finally getting a taste of her own medicine. That evening, a hastily assembled HOA meeting took place. Stuart didn't attend. He was too busy enjoying the view of his rising wall. But he got updates from the same kind neighbor Marvin, who had once given him a sympathetic nod. Marvin told him that Karen ranted about public safety, property values, and HOA authority. The board sat in stunned silence, not sure what to do. Their usual scare tactics, fines, violation notices, threats, were failing miserably. Why? Because Stuart had made sure everything was by the book. The city inspector came the next day, thanks to Karen's frantic phone calls. After carefully reviewing the permits and safety guidelines, the inspector shrugged. "Everything's in order." That simple statement made Karen turn pale. She had always counted on the city siding with her. Not this time. Things escalated when someone posted pictures of the half-built wall on social media. The post went viral in local Facebook groups and next-door forums. "New guy builds a giant wall to fight HOA tyrant," read one headline. Stuart started getting messages from strangers, even from neighboring towns, who cheered him on. Some had their own stories of nightmare HOAs that trampled on homeowners' rights. Naturally, Karen fumed. She began distributing flyers door to door, claiming Stuart was destabilizing property values. She circulated a petition to force him to stop construction, but only a handful of people signed because a growing number of neighbors actually admired Stuart's courage. Finally, after about 2 weeks of non-stop building, the monstrous wall was complete. It was taller than some of the smaller trees around it, standing with thick gray cinder blocks reinforced by steel rods inside. Even a stiff wind wouldn't topple it. Karen seemed ready to drop from sheer frustration. She had used every tactic in the HOA's book: fake fines, threatening letters, unannounced inspections. None of it mattered. Stuart's towering fortress was here to stay. The wall's sudden fame brought increased attention to Karen's behavior. Neighbors started swapping stories more openly on social media. People found out that she had been manipulating the board for her personal vendettas for years. The comment threads were on fire. "She forced me to paint my mailbox 3 times. She made me remove a bench from my yard because it was too bright. She fined me for leaving my trash bin out 10 minutes past pickup time." Marvin posted a detailed account of how Karen once threatened to remove his entire fence because she claimed it was built a few inches too close to a sidewalk. She demanded he hire a licensed land surveyor to remark the boundary, on his dime, just so she could confirm she was right. When the survey proved Marvin's fence was perfectly legal, Karen refused to reimburse him for the surveyor's fee. The mailbox fiasco also came up, with multiple people pointing out that tampering with or removing a mailbox without USPS permission could be a federal offense. All of this negative publicity prompted a heated reaction from Karen and her few remaining supporters. They tried to spin the narrative, painting Stuart as a troublemaker, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. And it only got worse when another neighbor discovered that the HOA was suspiciously short on funds, possibly because Karen spent money on her personal projects, like re-landscaping her yard with plants that apparently had been paid for out of the HOA budget. Sensing the tide shifting, some of the more moderate board members whispered about dethroning Karen to save the HOA's reputation. Karen caught wind of this and called for an urgent board meeting behind closed doors. But word spread, and residents demanded transparency. The night of the meeting, Stuart decided to go, even though he wasn't expecting a warm welcome. The conference room was packed with neighbors who wanted answers. Karen tried to start the session by rattling off minor agenda items, but people shouted her down, demanding to talk about the alleged misuse of funds and her power grabs. For once, Karen looked shaken. Amid the shouting, an older board member named Gloria stood up, face pale, and revealed that she'd been pressured by Karen for years to vote the way Karen wanted. When Gloria once questioned a fine that seemed unfair, Karen threatened to block repairs on Gloria's roof. "I just had enough," Gloria admitted tearfully. A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. By the end of the night, an emergency vote was taken to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. The motion passed by a landslide. A hush filled the room. Karen's face burned red with humiliation and rage. She slammed her clipboard onto the table and stormed out without a word. Stuart watched in awe. He had started out simply defending his backyard, but ended up igniting a full-on rebellion against Karen's tyranny. But was it really over? For a short while, it seemed the community was free of Karen's reign. The new HOA interim president, a pleasant woman named Isabella, sent out an official apology letter to all residents for the past improprieties. She also promised that any bogus fines would be reviewed and refunded if found unfair. Parkview Estate breathed a collective sigh of relief. Stuart took a moment to breathe too, proud that his bold stand had sparked such a major change, but the victory felt shaky. Karen had left the meeting in such a rush. Where did she go? She just vanished from social media, and rumor had it she was still living in her house, stewing over her defeat. One sunny Saturday, Stuart decided to finish some yard work near his new fortress of a wall. He was clearing leaves when he spotted a figure lurking at the edge of his property. When he walked closer, he recognized the short blonde bob, Karen. She looked unkempt, her eyes red as if she'd been crying or raging. Stuart braced himself. She sneered. "You think you're a hero for building that wall, but you're just a troublemaker. I lost everything because of you." Stuart set down his rake. "Karen, you did that to yourself. You had no right to steal my land or harass everyone else." She stepped closer. "You'll regret crossing me. Mark my words." Before he could answer, she spun around and stormed off. A chill ran through him. He wondered if she was all talk or if something else was coming. Sure enough, Karen had one last card to play. She rallied the handful of loyal board members she had left, convincing them to file a lawsuit against Stuart. The suit claimed that his gigantic wall was a public nuisance, lowering property values and posing a safety hazard. They demanded it be torn down immediately, or he pay enormous fines. Even though Karen was no longer HOA president, the old bylaws allowed board members to use leftover funds to continue a legal fight they had started. Stuart and Nina, his lawyer, met over coffee and pored over the lawsuit. Nina shook her head. "There's no real basis here. Their best shot is to claim it violates some aesthetic code, but we have all the city permits." Stuart frowned. "She's trying to bankrupt me with legal fees, isn't she?" "Probably," Nina said. "But we'll fight back." They countersued, not just defending the wall, but also pointing to a laundry list of Karen's and the HOA's past misdeeds. They demanded compensation for the harassment, illegal removal of his mailbox, potentially a federal offense, and emotional distress. If Karen and her allies wanted a war, Stuart was ready. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the big showdown. Reporters from local stations had caught wind of the Parkview Estate War, as some dubbed it. Everyone wanted a seat for the drama. Stuart noticed Karen sitting stiffly next to her attorney, wearing a crisp suit and an expression that screamed, "I'm better than all of you." The HOA's lawyer argued that the wall was ugly, that it clashed with the neighborhood's character, and that it hampered communal enjoyment. But Nina calmly produced photos of other tall fences in the area, as well as city documents proving no violations. Then Nina handed the judge a dossier detailing Karen's history, the mailbox fiasco, her forging of documents to claim property, her intimidation of neighbors. The judge's expression grew stern as he flipped through the evidence. When Karen took the stand, she tried to paint herself as a dedicated volunteer who cared only about keeping Parkview Estate beautiful and orderly. But cross-examination was brutal. Nina confronted her about threatening to confiscate property corners without legal grounds and removing a mailbox, a possible federal offense. Karen started losing composure, stammering, contradicting herself. The moment that took everyone's breath away was a sudden revelation from Marvin, who discovered something shocking in the city's public records just days before the trial. The official plans that Karen had used to claim Stuart's backyard was a community walkway turned out to be a forged document. The real city plan never included a walkway there at all. Karen had apparently doctored a portion of an old city map to fabricate her claim. There it was, in black and white, a total fake. Even Karen's own lawyer looked horrified. The judge demanded an explanation, and Karen fumbled for excuses, blaming clerical errors. But the evidence was overwhelming. That was the high-tension plot twist no one saw coming. Karen hadn't just been overzealous. She was forging official records. The judge ruled decisively in Stuart's favor. Not only did he get to keep his wall, but the HOA was found liable for harassment. The judge also referred Karen's document forgery to the district attorney's office, which might lead to criminal charges. She was ordered to pay a hefty fine, and the remains of the lawsuit against Stuart collapsed like a house of cards. Stuart's giant wall also became an odd tourist attraction. Folks from nearby towns stopped by to snap selfies and post them on social media with hashtags like #WallOfFreedom or #ByeByeKaren. Some even suggested painting a mural on it. A group of art students from a local college approached Stuart with sketches of an idea, a cartoon version of Karen scowling, towering behind a group of smiling residents. One last surprise came when a local developer offered Stuart a very generous sum for his property. They wanted to buy it, wall and all, to turn it into a mini cultural landmark. At first, he scoffed at the idea of leaving. After all, he'd poured so much energy into defending this place. But the offer was tempting. He could easily pay off all his debts and move somewhere else to start fresh, free of the drama's lingering shadows. In the end, Stuart decided to sell. The developer kept the wall intact, turning the space into a small public park where visitors could see the famous HOA Freedom mural. Stuart's neighbors thanked him for everything he did, and he promised to visit. On his last day, he stood in front of that massive wall, letting his hand rest on the painted bricks. He felt proud, relieved, and ready for a new chapter.